All right, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Dukuzumurenyi, and I will be your professor for History of North Africa, History 312. Because the class is starting late into the semester, we will need to meet. Right now we meet twice per week. We will need to meet an additional time per week. So I'll need to speak with the class representative after class so that we can get together and pick another time that you'll also meet, because you have course material that has to be made up because it took them so long to get you a professor for the class. And you've already missed 7 weeks of class, if I'm not mistaken. So in order to be able to make that time up, instead of us meeting twice a week for 4 hours, we'll need to meet 4 times a week for 8 hours. So you'll have to get with the class. I'll meet with the class representative, and then the class representative will speak with you to see when we can harmonize all of the different schedules so that we can make that additional time. That being said, I'd like to welcome you to History of North Africa, the class. I think you will find it exciting, interesting subject matter. A little bit about myself. As I said, my name is Dr. Ambakisye-Okang Dukuzumurenyi. I'm originally from the United States, born in the United States. My family from the United States as well. And I will be leading you in this journey through a history of North Africa. I'm not going to begin the class in the normal fashion. Normally, you might get started about talking about the history of North Africa, different things that have occurred there. But we're going to begin with a simple question. And that question is, as Africans, why do we study our history? As Africans, why do we study history? And more importantly, why do we study our history? Before you start to study any class dealing with history, you need to understand, why are you studying history? Are you studying history because you're students and it is a required course and you need this class in order to graduate? Are you studying history because you like the subject of history? Why do we as Africans study history? Why do we as Africans, that is, as Watu-Weusi, as black women and men, descendants of the children of the sun, the mothers and fathers of Africa, the land of Bilad et Sudan, the land of the blacks, why do we study history? Why do we as black Africans, as Watu-Weusi, why do we study history? Why do we do that? And especially, why do we study the history of Africa? And as we are doing here in this class, why do we study Hadithi ya Afrika ya Kaskazini? Why do we study the history of North Africa? You have to have a motive, a reason for doing something. Makusudi, what is your intentionality? When you do something, you have a purpose. What is the intentionality that you are pursuing in studying history, and what is your intentionality for studying African history? That word, makusudi, is very important, because every time you do something, you have an intention. So we as Watu-Weusi, why are we studying Hadithi ya Afrika ya Kaskazini? Now, and yes, I say we as Africans, kwa sababu, no matter whether we were born in Tanzania, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, or the Central African Republic, all which are states whose boundaries and governments were established by colonialist invaders, conquerors, and enslavers from Mulaya, or whether we are descendants of Africans who were taken away from Africa in enslavement and were born in the United States, Brazil, India, Guyana, Trinidad, or Haiti, or whether we are the descendants of Watu-Weusi the original rulers of Afrika ya Kaskazini, who are now oppressed by the Arab invaders of Afrika ya Kaskazini, we are still Africans. Mwalimu Nyerere said in one of his last speeches that he gave that we'd spent the last 50 years trying to be Tanzanians, trying to be South Africans, trying to be Zimbabweans, and he said we failed, and he said that's a good thing we failed. Because if you look at Ulaya, if you look at the European Union, oh yeah, they might be German, they might be French, but they understand the necessity of union. They understand the necessity of Jumuiya ya Afrika, an African union, a unity of Africans. So whether we come from wherever these places are, because we have Africans who are in India, over 100 million, the Dravidians and the Dalit. We have the Maori in Australia, the Australian Aborigines. These are African peoples. So we are Africans, and remembering that we are Watu-Weusi, we then have to come to the question, why do we as Watu-Weusi study the history of North Africa, of East Africa, of West Africa, of Central Africa, the history of Africans in the United States, the history of Africans in the Caribbean? Why do we study history? And that's a question you need to think about. Now, see, we are Africans, and we are not merely some national designation. You see, I was born in the United States, but that only signifies citizenship. Umwananchi. That's it. Nothing else. It does not signify identity. So when you study history, you must have it clear in your mind, identity. Because if you have identity clear in your mind, then you have makusudi, you have intentionality. Because your identity ties you to a piece of bark. Your identity ties you to land. And land is the basis of power. And land is also an aspect of how we get our identity. So now, but why do we study the history of Afrika ya Kaskazini? Mhenga Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, he said this, as well as Professor Marimba Ani, and she is a professor of African Cultural Studies in the United States, and countless other Africans have told us this is why we study the history of Africa, of Afrika ya Kaskazini, of Afrika ya Magharibi, of Afrika ya Kusini, of Afrika ya Maskazini. Here is why we study this history. They say that we as Africans are African not because we were born in Africa. See, if you understand science, if you understand the science of epigenetics, and I'm not talking about genetics, but the science of epigenetics, the science of epigenetics helps us to understand that you are African because Africa is born in your genes. Each of us carries within our genes the complete and total biological and cultural history of black people from the beginning of time. You are not, you think your genes were just made up just for you? No. You are the reproduction of genes that have been in existence from the beginning of time. So they say Africa is born in you. It's in our genes. It's in our DNA. Our entire biological makeup. And whether we like it or not, that's the way it is. Now, when we embrace this, whoa, what a wonderful thing it is when we embrace that fact of being African. So when you study history, you have to make sure you have that identity completely established in you. Your citizenship may be in Tanzania, but your identity is African. Now, as to why study the history, that is, study the past, we can learn something from the Wahenga. our African Wahanga have clearly given us a reason as to why we study history. Here is something that comes from the Mhanga-Keti. Mhanga-Keti was a king, an ancient African king who ruled in the Nile Valley in the year 2160 BCE. When I say BCE, as you know, we're talking about before the Common Era. And this is what he had to say concerning our study of the past. Said this almost, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Listen to what he said. He said, consider the Wahanga as an archetype, as an example, as a perfect example of an ideal. And then he said, emulate them. Do as they have done. Do as they think, as they thought. Do as they did. For what we create is brought forth from right knowledge. And you can only get right knowledge by studying your past. He said, we can look and meditate on how their words are engraved in stone. Our ancestors have left the words and left a history for us written in stone, written in everything that they've done. And when you study history, you are studying the actions of the Wahanga. He says, open your eyes so that you may study their words and reproduce their acts. For every master, every expert, every mtaalam once had need of a mwalimu. Everybody needs a teacher. Everyone needs to be taught. And it is from our ancestors that we are taught. And we learn of our ancestors by studying history. So now this is one reason. Another historian, Mhanga John Henrik Clarke, a historian from the United States, he had this to say about history. He said, the events which transpired 5,000 years ago, 5 years ago, 5 minutes ago, have determined what will transpire, have determined what will happen 5 minutes from now, 5 years from now, or 5,000 years from now. All history is a current event. Think about it. If you think the past doesn't matter, let me take a hammer, knock you upside the head just hard enough so you forget everything. If you think the past don't matter, just let me hit you in the head so you can forget everything. And then suddenly, you will have to learn all over again. You'll forget how to talk, got to learn speech again. You'll forget how to walk, got to learn how to walk again. Because everything that you are right now is the result of things that happened in the past. It is. So this is why he tells us why we study history. Now, another ancestor, Mhanga Amos N. Wilson, an American-born African psychologist, he gave a lecture. He said, history as an instrument of power. And he gave us a reason as to why we study history. He says, we're talking again about why study history. So a lot of people think history is just a study of dates, you see, and reading information about things that happened in the past. So, oh, that's all history is, just some dates. So, you know, you take a history class, you learn about a whole bunch of things that happened in the past, you get some dates or some events, you take a test, and that's it. He said, that is certainly not the case. History in the human mind is always present. History doesn't live out there. History lives in here. It lives in you. Culture doesn't live out there. Culture lives in you. Starts in here. So he said, things that happened to you at 1 year old, at 2 year old, when you were 3 years old, are operating in you right at this moment. And the way you react to other people, the kind of taste that you have, you know, the things you like, the desires you have, the kind of love relations you seek, and all of those things are to a great extent determined by your experience before you were 3 or 4 years old. As a matter of fact, if you study developmental psychology of the black child, you will learn that everything that happens to the mother, her entire history, is carried in that child. Yes. See, the Wahanga knew this. If we were to go right now to Western Africa, actually Southwestern Africa, into Namibia, the Himba, Mabila, the Himba, guess when they say a person's life begins? The Himba say your life doesn't begin when you are born. The Himba say your life begins when your mother and father began to talk about you before they even made you. So the moment the man and the woman begin to talk about the child, that is the moment that the Himba began to count the creation of the child. But the history of the mother is in the child. So you see, that history thing is deep. It's not just merely some dates and all of that stuff. No. But between birth and 2 or 3 or 4 years old, all of these things operate right now to color your perception of other people and of yourself, to determine to a good degree the nature of your interaction with other people. In other words, then, the past is not something that's dead and gone and dropped off in your mind. It operates right here at this very moment, this very second. The entire history of Afrika ya Kaskazini is carried in you right now. Why do I say that? Because everyone who is in Tanzania right now, our people migrated here from the Nile Valley. When you look at, for example, I'll use the Inyakusa. The Inyakusa tell you that they migrated to Tanzania 400 years ago from West Africa. Now, why would somebody pack up and migrate from West Africa to East Africa 400 years ago? What was going on 400 years ago in the world that would make the Inyakusa come to into what is now Tanzania? And every other people who are here migrated here. The Nile River, which stretches from here, in Tanzania, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, is a cultural highway for African people for several thousand years. So you see, the history of North Africa is not just a history up there, it's a history that you are intimately connected to. So when you study the history of North Africa as Africans, you are studying the history of yourself. And that is important. In other words, then the past is not something that's dead and gone and dropped off in your mind. It operates right here at this very moment, this very second, and it will operate until the day you die. But when you die, it won't stop operating, because you're going to pass that history on in your DNA to your Watoto. And then your Watoto are going to pass it on to their Watoto. And it'll continue to be passed on, because history is alive in you, in me. It ain't dead. History is not something that's written in words and it's in a book. It lives in you and it continues to live. If you look at the history of a race of people, the way you look at an individual, those experiences that happened to us 200 and 300 years ago are not dead and gone by a long shot. The ways we relate to other people, many of our political goals today, many of our social goals right now, many of the things we desire to achieve as a people come from our experience during colonialism, during slavery. It comes from our experience in the past. Many of us are sitting here right now wanting to assimilate with white people. We want to be Wazungu. Some of us do. Just walk around and see all the people with the skin bleaching creams. We take the skin bleaching creams. We think we're too dark, so we bleach ourselves. Because we want to be like the people who conquered us. That's a part of the history. You can't deny it. Every time we turn on the television, you see a television host here in Tanzania who doesn't bleach their skin. If I'm sitting in Dar es Salaam in a restaurant, I can see at least 5 people who are going to come through there who have bleached their skin. That ain't natural. Is it natural for you to suddenly decide? You think it's natural that a child is born and looks in the mirror and says, oh, I'm too dark. I should be lighter. Let me go buy some skin bleaching cream and bleach myself. That's not normal. That is not normal behavior. It comes from our history, the experiences we have experienced. Go back and look at Mwalimu Nyerere told you. You know, when somebody conquers you, and then they have you in their power, and then you grow up in that power, you started thinking that that's the way to be. That's what he was telling you all those years. Go buy the books. I know you've all read all of his books, haven't you? You're in Tanzania. I know if I'm from the United States and I done read all his books, I know you done read them and you're from Tanzania, right? He ain't saying nothing no different than I'm saying right now. So now, many of us are struggling with feelings of inferiority and all of those kinds of things. Where do you think that started? It didn't start right now. It is the result of the past. It started as soon as we were conquered. This is what he's telling us. Where else can history be alive but in the minds of people? If people were not in existence, what would be the point of history? We wouldn't even have to be discussing history. Another indication of the importance of history, of course, is the fact that those who conquered us, those who rule over us, and those who dominate us have worked very hard at distorting our history. You remember, they told us we didn't have a history. So then you read the history books, and they say the history of North Africa is the history of Arabs, it's the history of Europeans, it's the history of everybody but Africans, and it's in Africa. As a matter of fact, if you look at the way history is written, they snatch North Africa right out of Africa and say it is a part of the history of Asia, Southwest Asia. Go to the library and get a geography book. And when they study Africa, they'll show the geography and history of sub-Saharan Africa. Like there's some big dividing line or something. And they'll take North Africa, it's not a part of Africa. They done took that. Matter of fact, do you know there are people in the world, when you start talking about the countries of North Africa, they don't even know you're talking about Africa. I was in America, I told somebody, I'm going to Egypt. I said, I'm going to Africa. They said, oh, where you going? I'm going to Egypt. They say, I just said you was going to Africa. I said, where do you think Egypt is? It's in Africa. But because of the way other people have written history, you'd swear that North Africa wasn't a part of Africa. You'd swear that there were no Watuweusi anywhere in North Africa. But that is not the case. All right, you have to look at the people who dominated us and what they were doing to hide history from us and falsify history, lie about the history. Hey, we don't have a history. You know, your people never did anything. They don't have no history. You have to look at these things. Why would somebody go through all of that trouble with doing it if history was just dates and some stuff in the past? So if history was not that important to everyday life, to real life, and to concrete activities, why then has the United States, the United Kingdom, France, why have all of these nations, Germany, why the people who rule, why have they worked so hard to destroy African history? If history is not important. See, because history is very important. History is an instrument of power. History tells you who you are, tells you who you have been, tells you what you must become. You should be learning lessons when you study history. All right, so if history was not that important in everyday life to real people and to concrete activities, then why has every nation worked to distort African history? Why are they resisting our telling the truth about African history? If history was not important, then why do you think that the Europeans who were writing the history of Tanzania said that the Kiswahili were not an African people? Oh, they say the Kiswahili were Persian, they were Arab, but they said they were not African. Now you have a scholar right here in Tanzania, Felix Shami, at the University of Dar es Salaam. He's clearly written and shown you that the Kiswahili are African people. But why would somebody even come to Africa and then start saying, oh, this is not African people, if history were not important? All right. You see, in other words then, we need to gain a new appreciation of history and need to recognize that history is always present and to a great extent. If we are to change our present behavior, that if we are to change the future, then we must change the past and change our relationship to the past. You cannot see the history of Afrika ya Kaskazini as a history of those people. It is a history of Watu Weusi, wherever we are on the continent. Nearly every people on the continent trace their origins back to Afrika ya Kaskazini. Because we are a migrating people. We'll pack up and migrate in a minute. I am descended from the Fulani of West Africa. I say West Africa, but you can find the Fulani from West Africa to East Africa. And they're constantly migrating back and forth, back and forth. We can come right here. You'll notice that we have borders here that the Europeans created, but people migrate back and forth all the time. They don't really pay attention to the borders. If you go to the borders of Kenya and Somalia to Samburu, they migrate back and forth with their cattle. We're migrating people. So history is very important. And therefore, the falsification and mislabeling of black consciousness deals with why we should study history. It deals with history as mythology. You see, if you've been given the wrong history about a person and how that can change your behavior toward a person. If I tell you a lie about history, it can change your behavior because history is memory. History is memory. It's somebody's memory. The history of Africa is the memory of African people. The history of North Africa is the memory of African people. History is all about memory. And if you have a proper understanding of your history, then you can have a proper understanding of your present and what you must do into the future. That's that connection. All right, so another ancestor had this to say about history. Malcolm X had this to say. He said, when you deal with the past, you're dealing with history. You're dealing actually with the origin of a thing. When you know the origin, you know the cause. It's impossible for you and me to have a balanced mind in any society without going into the past. Because in this particular society, as we function and fit into it right now, we're such an underdog. We're trampled upon, we're looked upon as almost nothing. Now, if we don't go into the past and find out how we got this way, we will think that we were always this way. And if you think that you were always in the condition that you're in right now, it's impossible for you to have much confidence in yourself. You become worthless, almost nothing. But when you go back into the past and find out where you once were, then you will know that you once had attained a higher level, had made great achievements, contributions to society, civilization, science, and so forth. And you know that if you once did it, you can do it again. You automatically get the incentive, the inspiration, and the energy necessary to duplicate what our forefathers did. That's why we study history. It is memory. It tells us what we are capable of. And lastly, Chancellor Williams, an African historian, he said this. Chancellor Williams was an African historian, wrote history. This is what he had to say about our writing of history. He said, I make a more definite break from the old line of historians, all Western trained scholars, people who've learned about history in the West. He said, to be objective and more scientific, this school insists the research scholar should do no more than present the comprehensive and fully documented results of his investigations. There should be no subjective commentaries, no editorializing. One should just present the factual data and leave interpretation and evaluation to the reader. This may not only be the correct viewpoint, but it is even beautiful for historians who represent the already arrived people who control the world. They can well afford the luxury of historical knowledge for knowledge's sake, the great satisfaction that comes from just knowing how things came to be. But the black historian, member of a race under perpetual siege and fighting an almost invisible war for survival, dare not follow in these footsteps of the master. Quite the contrary. After faithfully researching and piecing together the fragmented record of the race's history, the task of critical analysis and interpretation should begin. What were our strengths as Africans in the past? In what respects were we most vulnerable? Where did we go wrong? And all this, like the study of history itself, must be for the express purpose of determining what to do now. In short, the black historian, if he is to serve his generation, must not hesitate to declare what he thinks the results of these studies mean. For even when our history shows us where we have been weak, it is also showing us through our own efforts we can become strong again. So that, my friends, is why we study history. We are studying history to see where we have been great, to see what it is we are capable of, to restore our mind so that we can then move forward and do great things again. And so now that concludes my short introductory lecture for today. On Thursday evening, we will get started into our memory. See, when I say history, I'm talking of the history of Africa. It's our memory. We shall restore our memory about our history as Watu Weusi in Afrika ya Kaskazini. If there are no questions, I need to speak with the class representative, and I'll see everyone on Thursday evening. This is what they gave me for yeah, this is all they gave me. Yeah.